Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Alexander Rosenberg. He is the R. Taylor Cole Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Duke University, and today we're going to talk about scientism, nihilism, and related topics, focusing loosely on his book, The Atheist's Guide to Reality. So, Dr. Rosenberg, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on again.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to talking about these subjects.
Okay, so perhaps let's start with some basic questions. How would you define scientism?
So let's define it first in the way that its opponents define it. So
Okay.
scientism is the unreasonable belief that the science's methods are the only methods for acquiring knowledge, and the equally unreasonable belief that the scientific description of reality is the most well-established and complete description of reality. So the scientistic person, and you can't call us scientists because a scientist is somebody else, and I often use the word scientistic as a noun. The scientistic person accepts that definition, but removes the words unreasonable. So we hold that the only way to acquire knowledge is the way the sciences acquire knowledge, and that the scientific description of reality is the most well-established and reasonable description, and that anything incompatible with it must be mistaken.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that sort of difference between a scientist and a scientistic person. So what would you say is the relationship between science and scientism? Would you say that, for example, a scientist should be committed in any way to scientism?
So the difference, of course, is that a scientist is someone who employs these methods to acquire information about the nature of reality. Um, and a scientist need not have a philosophy or a metaphysical worldview, or at any rate need not and may often usually not have one explicitly. Scientism, however, is a metaphysical and epistemological position, that is to say, a philosophical theory. And uh, it is my view that it is the best, most reasonable set of metaphysics and epistemologies to embrace. And I would encourage everyone to embrace scientism, certainly not only scientists. But scientists seem to me to be, if not implicitly committed to scientism, at least people whose rejection of scientism should be belied by the actual work that they do as scientists.
So could you give us some examples of questions that traditionally fall outside of the purview of science that scientism deals with?
So one might say that any question that apparently cannot be answered by science um, uh, falls out of its purview. And among these questions are, for example, normative questions, or questions about the nature of and our knowledge of mathematics. Um, those are two very broad sets of areas which are often identified as questions whose answers are beyond the reach of scientific methods. And the scientistic philosopher rejects the view that those two sorts of questions are beyond the reach of science.
But to answer these sort of questions, does a scientific person resort to the scientific method or something that derives from it?
So that's a very good question, and I'm inclined to say that among the tools of the scientific method are the rule that you should accept the best among competing explanations that is subject to empirical test and to the degree tested at least vindicated. So the inference to the best explanation rule is one that the scientistic philosopher employs and holds to be endorsed by science and employs to answer those two questions that I just gave as illustrations of questions apparently beyond the reach of science. And of course, there are other questions that some hold to be beyond the reach of science. For example, questions about the supernatural or the deity or human nature or other issues that philosophers have argued about for the last several thousand years.
Mm-hmm. So let's say that, for example, we have a metaphysical question like, what is reality? Is science well equipped to answer that kind of question?
I believe so, yes. And the description that science gives of the nature of that reality seems to me to be relatively unequivocal, although, of course, there are many outstanding questions about the nature of reality. And every time we nail down more of the nature of reality, we open up further questions beyond those already answered. So the issue often turns out to be what has science actually showed us about the nature of reality. That's what philosophers of science, for example, often dispute. And even among scientistic philosophers, there could be disagreements about what science actually shows.
Mm-hmm. But would a discipline like physics be the best way of trying to answer this question?
Yes, at least the version of scientism that I endorse says that the physical facts fix all the facts, and therefore, if you want to know what the facts are about the nature of reality, look to physics.
Mm-hmm. So let's now talk about some questions regarding human psychology, the evolution of human psychology, and perhaps some aspects that traditionally have fallen outside of the purview of science and are more philosophical, let's say. So what does evolutionary theory have to say about our psychology?
Well, what it has to say about our psychology can't be painted with very detailed brushstrokes for a variety of different reasons. For one thing, the data is not yet available, and evolutionary and other psychologists have not yet pursued the matter far enough to establish hypotheses that are robust enough and also reveal much about the nature of our psychology. But what's clear is that at least some of our psychological dispositions have to be adaptations. And they were obviously important enough to get us from the bottom of the food chain on the African savanna to the top of it in a relatively brief period of time. Now, what are they? Well, this is a matter that still requires a great deal of discussion. I'm inclined to say that among the most interesting of our psychological capacities and dispositions, especially as they are individuated, enumerated, identified by common sense, may well not succumb to an obvious adaptational explanation that shows that they've been selected for their contribution to fitness. So, for example, consciousness, I do not think represents a domain of mental activity for which there is a single adaptational explanation. Does that mean that consciousness did not emerge as a result of a Darwinian process? Not at all. What it means is that consciousness consists in a set, a variety, a large number of different cognitive capacities, all of which evolved and co-evolved together owing to their contributions to a variety of different adaptational strategies.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that evolutionary theory is the best scientific tool we have to understand certain psychological phenomena that we as humans have, like, for example, religious phenomena, our belief in God, cultural aspects of our reality, and so on?
So I think that the general answer to that question is yes, because it's evolutionary adaptation that actually identifies the functions of the brain that we need to understand. And these functional regions of the brain subserve, deliver many of the kinds of religious, ethical, social, and cultural predispositions that we have, or combined with the environment to do so, which is a more probable outcome. But I also think that a much better immediate experimental approach to understanding the mind comes to us from cognitive neuroscience and not from comparative evolutionary phylogenetic research that can only identify differences between our cognitive dispositions and those of other primates.
So this also is a question that I think comes, or some people put on the table when discussing evolutionary theory and evolution by natural selection. Does anything have any purpose in the universe?
Well, now that's a question that gets back to scientism, and I want to hold that there are no purposes and that it was Darwin's wonderful discovery of the mechanism of blind variation and environmental filtration, aka natural selection. It's not selection, it's filtration, a passive process. It's Darwin's discovery that banished purpose from the universe. Newton having banished it from physical domain, Darwin advanced the boundaries from which it had been banished to include the biological domain. And now in the 20th and 21st centuries, we're engaged in banishing it from the psychological domain.
Mm-hmm. And does life specifically have any meaning? Of course, this is another scientific question, I guess.
No. Do I need to say more? The scientific philosopher is certainly committed to denying purpose anywhere in the universe, including in our own heads.
But what about when people come up with their own purposes and meanings? Does that make them real in any way?
So, people's conscious psychological deliberations and ratiocinations provide us with a large number of illusions. Most of these, or many of these, or maybe just some of these, are highly adaptive. For example, the illusion that the universe, that things are colored, solid, smooth, hot, cold, etc. All of those illusions are extremely adaptive. They enable us to escape threats and to exploit opportunities. And that, however, does not contribute anything at all to the question of whether they are real or not, the properties that we identify in the world as a result of the operation of our sensory and cognitive capacities. And I think that the same goes for much of our own thinking about our own purposes and the meaning of our lives. These are sometimes adaptive illusions, but they're always illusions.
Mm-hmm. But because these illusions are at least in part the result of selective pressures coming from the environments we were exposed to during our evolutionary history, would it be fair to say that at least they are pragmatically true? Because, I mean, they have to do with how we interact with the world?
Well, I don't think there's any such thing as pragmatically true. There's
Okay.
true, and there's pragmatically useful, and I've agreed that many of these psychological dispositions and capacities of ours are useful from the point of view of Darwinian selection, but do they actually reflect the nature of reality? Well, they might or they might not. So here's an example. I don't think that there was natural selection for the ability to do multivariable calculus, right? Our ability, or the ability of some of us to do multivariable calculus, is maybe a spandrel, as Gould and Lewontin said, a consequence of the selection for other abilities. And this ability to do calculus has led us to uncover a variety of different theorems or truths that apply to reality. So electromagnetism is a phenomenon truly and correctly described by Stokes' theorem and Green's theorem, two theorems of multivariable calculus. And therefore, we acquire truths about the nature of reality by the use of capacities that were initially selected for, okay, but not because there was any selection for acquiring multivariable calculus, for doing mathematics.
Right. We've already talked about this in more depth last time, but do people's beliefs have any sort of influence on their behavior?
Well, certainly the brain states, which the beliefs, as we individuate beliefs, are subserve, the brain states that produce in us the conscious or even the non-conscious states that we describe as beliefs, okay, are real, right? But are those neurological configurations, those neural circuits, beliefs or not? Do they actually have intentional content? That, I think, must be answered no. And in that sense, our beliefs, or that we have beliefs, is one of those adaptive illusions, like our belief that the world is colored or solid or smooth or cold or hot. The conscious experience that leads us to, for example, you and me believe right now that we're talking to one another, okay, that conscious belief is, in my view, just as illusory as the belief that the sky that we could be looking at when we turn our heads and look out the window is blue.
Mm-hmm. And what about consciousness more generally? Do you think it's real, it's an epiphenomenon, or what exactly?
So, can something be real and an epiphenomenon? I suppose the answer to that is yes, but I also don't think that consciousness is epiphenomenal. That is, I think the package of different psychological capacities and activities and processes that we identify with the label consciousness, that package is composed of a large number of components, each one of which has effects and is therefore not epiphenomenal. Okay, and is also real, at least because the scientific view is that if something has effects, it's real, and if something is real, then it has effects.
Mm-hmm. Do people have free will, or is free will in any way compatible with a deterministic scientific view of the universe?
So I don't think that free will is compatible with either deterministic or an indeterministic view of the universe. Okay. But the illusion of free will is so well established in our social, cultural, literary, artistic, moral, and social fabric that the illusion of free will is so well entrenched in all of those areas of life that hardly anyone can really give it up, even for a more than a sustained few minutes. as Strawson said, our reactive attitudes kick in so strongly that even for us scientific people, the language of free will is unavoidable. But again, it's going to turn out to be a very useful illusion, in my view. So you could reply, well, if it's such a useful illusion, why don't we say it's pragmatically true? Well, it turns out that though it is an illusion useful in many aspects of life, it's not useful in all aspects. So, for example, if we rearrange the criminal justice system without appeal to the concept of free will, we'd probably secure much better results in terms of policing and social control.
Right. So, I mean, in that sense, the concept of free will is fundamental to the workings of our, I mean, of our legal and penal systems.
Right, exactly. Well put.
So, can scientism answer questions like, does God exist?
Of course.
Okay, and what is the answer?
No. So, does science answer the question whether Santa Claus exists? Of course, right? The
Yeah.
question whether God exists is on a par with the question of whether Santa Claus exists and has an equally powerfully convincing answer.
And how do scientific people understand morality? What is morality?
So, morality is part of the set of systems of social and cultural control that you mentioned before, that's also indispensable to our having moved up the food chain from the bottom to the top on the African savannah, because morality governs cooperation and collaboration, particularly among conspecifics, and therefore the universality of certain aspects of the human moral code is not surprising given the universality of certain features of the environment within which humans, relatively puny creatures compared to other megafauna, have managed to secure dominance of the entire planet. And that's how we should understand ethics, that it's a highly adaptive, group selected set of regularities in human behavior that harness our emotions to deliver adaptive institutions. But is there such a thing as moral rightness or moral goodness or intrinsic value of the sort endorsed by most of the ethical theories that philosophers wrestle with? The answer is no. That makes us scientific philosophers nihilists, but I insist it makes us nice nihilists, that is, ones who recognize that cooperation and collaboration require behavior in accordance with those norms that everybody identifies as morally well-grounded.
So, moral values do not exist at all.
Yes, in the sense in which the philosophers have sought to identify them and establish their existence.
And what about an idea like moral progress? Does that make sense with this sort of moral nihilistic perspective in mind?
So consider the concept of progress, evolutionary progress. The idea of global evolutionary progress makes no sense in the context of Darwinian theory. All progress is local. Today's adaptations may be tomorrow's maladaptations. The dinosaurs became extremely well adapted to their environments over 225 million years and then became extinct within a decade owing to the catastrophic asteroidal impact on the Yucatan. Our moral norms have been highly adaptive, okay, over a relatively short period of time in natural history of our planet and of our species, okay? But they might, under changed environmental conditions, turn out to be highly maladaptive. This is a hard concept to contemplate, although philosophers like David Hume and others, who, as far back as the 18th century, have actually thought about it and pointed out that morality is an adaptation under periods of moderate scarcity. Under periods of extreme scarcity, it's clearly not an adaptation.
Mm-hmm. So tell us more about nihilism and what do you think is the relationship between scientism and nihilism?
So nihilism is another one of those pejorative terms, like scientism, that has been employed as a stick with which to beat the scientific worldview. And there are, in the history of philosophy, at least beginning of the 19th century, few philosophers who would either be called nihilists or would call themselves nihilists. Maybe Schopenhauer is the only one that comes to mind, and he was more properly described as a pessimist. But I wouldn't attach myself a great deal of weight to this word, though sticks and stones will break my bones, names will never hurt me, and I might as well accept nihilism as a handy code word to identify the rejection of a range of different views, particularly in ethics. I think that if you're a scientist, you are committed to scientism, and scientism has a negative answer to the questions of the nature and foundation of morality, and that negative answer can be properly labeled nihilism. And that's the relation between the three concepts.
Mm-hmm.
Science and nihilism.
Right. But I mean, we've been talking about nihilism applied specifically to ethics, but would you consider any form of epistemic nihilism, for example?
Oh, absolutely not. The scientistic philosopher is committed to the claim that we have knowledge, which is the denial of epistemic nihilism, and that knowledge is given to us by the methods of natural science.
Mm-hmm. But how would you construct a defense of science with the idea in mind that perhaps we should reject other forms of knowledge? Why stop specifically at science?
The answer to that question, I think, for the scientistic philosopher is best formulated this way. What we're interested in acquiring knowledge is explanation. We want the right explanation of why things are as they are. And there's sufficient, at least initial agreement among most people about how things are arranged at a superficial level. And science successively refines an explanation of how things seem to us and seem to everybody. And it subjects those explanations to predictive test. And it's the predictive test that separates the good or the real explanations from the pseudo explanations, or those pseudo explanations that reduce our curiosity without actually expanding our knowledge. And insofar as you accept this priority of the demand for explanation along with the criterion of predictive success as the test that distinguishes real explanation from mere curiosity reduction, to that extent, I think you're committed to the methods of science, because only science can satisfy those two requirements. Now, you might say, in objection to scientism, well, what's so special about the demand for explanation, and what's so epistemically important about that? And I suspect that at that point, uh, the scientific philosopher gives an evolutionary explanation of why we crave explanations, but can't go any further by way of underwriting the epistemic foundations of explanation without going beyond scientism. So this might be, the beginning of an objection to scientism, that the scientific philosopher might himself or herself find a vulnerability.
Does scientism commit people to any sort of worldview having to do with life, like, for example, pessimism, optimism, or something like that?
I don't think so. Um, I think people's emotional attitudes are explained by neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience, and there's a spectrum of such attitudes. As we well know from biology, all human traits come across a nice, normal Gaussian distribution, and none of them is privileged over the others, except in terms of, say, local adaptiveness. Uh, I don't think the scientific philosopher has any basis for valuing some of these traits above others, except maybe saying that some of them are more conducive to local mental health than others.
But taking into account the fact that we have all of these evolved illusions that are to some extent useful for our day-to-day lives, if someone was to adopt a scientific perspective of the world, do you think that that would change significantly the way they live their lives?
I don't think so, because the way we live our lives is driven by the suite of emotions and cognitive capacities that um, uh, are the result, direct or indirect, of a process of blind variation and natural selection that goes back on this planet at least 3.5 billion years, and which we are incapable of escaping. So if you're basically a happy, well-adjusted, optimistic person, scientism and nihilism are incapable of undermining your optimism and satisfaction. But if you're miserable and depressive and otherwise unhappy, well, scientism won't help uh, with that either. On the other hand, various kinds of pharmaceuticals will.
Yeah. Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned the fact that scientism and nihilism, but now focusing mostly on scientism, have been used as pejorative. So, why do you think that's the case? Why do you think that they are not very popular terms with philosophers and even perhaps scientists?
Well, philosophers are likely to view scientism as the denial that there are any questions left over unanswerable by science and therefore within the proper purview of philosophy. Scientism appears to leave no room for an intellectual inquiry that secures knowledge, but which is not some branch of natural science. It's obvious that philosophers who have a strong commitment to the existence of their profession as an intellectually respectable domain of inquiry are going to reject scientism. And of course, all social scientists and humanists who also believe that their inquiries and their work proceeds within a domain that is beyond the reach of science are also going to reject scientism and view scientism as equally threatening.
Mhm. And particularly regarding the humanists and the social scientists, how would you think you would go about trying to convince them that perhaps scientism or a scientific perspective could even enrich their activity and their domains of knowledge?
So, um, in the case of the social sciences, it's obvious that if we want to secure the kinds of reliable understanding that natural sciences provided with regard to individual human behavior and social behavior, that we've got to use the same methods, or we won't secure that knowledge. However, when it comes to the humanities, you use the word knowledge to describe the domain within which they work, and the scientistic philosopher would deny that those are domains of knowledge. That doesn't mean that they don't exist as domains. It just means that the criteria that science imposes on the products of inquiry, those criteria don't apply in music and art, in literature, in film, in entertainment. Okay, what applies in those domains are matters of satisfaction of our emotions and the cultivation and stimulation of those feelings and desires and tastes. And there, in the humanities and in the arts, there's huge scope for wonderful creation. It just shouldn't be thought of as competing with science in the provision of knowledge. Now, many humanists will reject that view as somehow reducing the value or importance of what they do. But I think they're just confused about what its importance consists in.
Yeah, so for example, particularly when it comes to the humanities, how would you place things like art in the overall context of reality according to scientism?
No, art is a human creation. Its existence can't be denied by scientism, and scientism has no interest in denying its existence. What scientism says is, on the one hand, art can't be assessed for goodness or badness, greatness or banality on the basis of criteria drawn from science, physical, biological, psychological, or social. And on the other hand, whether or not a piece of art attains, or whether a piece of art satisfies human tastes and emotional needs, that's something that the scientist can examine and may even provide us with some understanding of. So as far back as in the last century, sociobiologists were interested in trying to explain why certain kinds of landscape paintings and certain kinds of architectural arrangements satisfy humans by suggesting that they reflect proportions that we or our ancestors experienced on the African savanna, and that we were attuned to by the long survival of humans in Africa. And that's an interesting kind of a theory, and provides at least an example of, if it's true, of the kind of understanding of artistic creation that science could provide.
Mm-hmm. Talking about atheists specifically, so the kinds of things we tend to associate atheists with is that they reject the existence of God. But looking at scientism more generally, would you say that there are any questions it deals with that atheists should also commit to the specific answers that scientism gives to those questions, apart from the existence of God?
So it depends on what ground you're an atheist. If you're an atheist because theism is incompatible with science, then you're committed to, it seems to me, to everything else that science commits us to in metaphysics and epistemology. So you should be, for consistency's sake, a scientistic person. But suppose you're an atheist for other reasons. You're an atheist because of the argument from evil. Okay? Now, the scientistic philosopher has problems with the concept of evil, of moral evil. Okay? So the scientific philosopher is not going to appeal to the argument from evil to conclude that theism is false. But a non-scientific person who has a strong substantive moral theory might well conclude, in fact, I think should conclude, that atheism is correct, but not for scientific reasons.
Right. So, just one last question. Do you think that scientism could be appealing to people who are not scientists themselves?
Of course, I'm not a scientist, and scientism is appealing to me. Lots of people are going to have difficulty understanding science, and particularly because they have difficulty with mathematics. These people, many of them, of course, spend a lot of time trying to understand popular scientific accounts that are not mathematical in order to find a way around their obstacles in digesting and understanding science the way scientists do. Those people are just as able to comprehend and to endorse scientism as people who have a deep and complete understanding of science. So it seems to me there could be lots of humanists and people who became humanists because they couldn't wrap their heads around natural science, okay, who might well want to endorse scientism.
Right. Okay, so Dr. Rosenberg, just before we go, would you like to mention any work of yours that perhaps would be relevant to the kinds of questions we talked about today?
Yes, so I wrote The Atheist Guide to Reality about 10 years ago. 3 years ago, I published a sequel. It's a well-disguised sequel, disguised in several ways. That is, the title is How History Gets Things Wrong, the Neuroscience of Our Addiction to Stories. And a lot of that book, in fact, most of that book is an amplification of one chapter, the 9th chapter of The Atheist Guide to Reality, and an attempt to respond to what many reviewers thought was the most counterintuitive or hard to accept component of the scientism elaborated in that book, which is why it is that we think that understanding the narrative story of something is, in some cases, the best way to understand it, in other cases, one way to understand it, and in other third cases, one of at least conveys some understanding. And I want to say that stories, narratives of the sort that we're familiar with in history, and of course in fiction and novels and other works of human creativity, those stories lull us into a false sense of curiosity reduction, make us think that we understand when they do not do so at all, because stories not only distract us from science, but themselves exploit features of human psychological process that were selected for to help us interact with one another, but make no contribution to our understanding. So that particular book, I think, is one that people who are either interested in historiography or science or historical method, or the social sciences, or how our conventional view of ourselves relates to the neuroscience of our brains, and are already sympathetic to scientism, might well pick up to help fill out the details of this view.
So I will be leaving links to those works in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Rosenberg, it has been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you, Ricardo. And from now on, no more Dr. Rosenberg. Let's be on a first name basis.
Okay. Hi guys, thank you for watching this episode until the end. The channel depends on your support to keep running, and so I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. You also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview and otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett, Pereira Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Ernst Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wissel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arnaud Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vos, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colomba, Jorge Pinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Ian Solon, Roman Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino. My producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffini, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.